Welcome to the kissfaq podcast. In today's special episode, just going to review Disc 2 of the Dressed to Kill Super Deluxe Edition box set. Before the release of this product, there was quite a bit of fan consternation that there wasn't going to be enough material to make a box set treatment for that album worthwhile. I think with the release and the inclusion of the Cobo and Davenport live shows, it's certainly been proved to be viable and a worthwhile addition to fans' collections. The remaster of the album itself, done by Bernie Grundman, is absolutely fantastic and well worth the price of admission if you go with the single disc option. The box itself is absolutely massive. The LP one, which I've obtained, is just 13 pounds was the shipping weight on it. It's so over the top, so massive. I've not had an LP box set prior. They did Creatures of the Night and Destroyer after the fact, so this was kind of the first experience with that format. I'm usually a digital-only guy, but I do like to have the book and the newspaper in particular from this. We're going to do a whole separate review of the actual box set as a panel, but for this episode I just want to go into some of the minutiae and detail for the recordings on Disc 2 that we simply won't have time to get into on that panel podcast. And I think it's Disc 2, which is really one of the most interesting in the box set package, simply because this is the one where questions arose about what could be included for Dressed to Kill. Historically, we knew that the Dressed to Kill album was rushed. They were basically dragged off the road by Neil Bogart, who needed more product to keep Casablanca ticking over. Casablanca was in a very dangerous position following the separation from Warner Brothers, who had handled their distribution during 1974, and he was very much in debt, very much struggling to stay viable as a record label, and in typical Neil Bogart was spending his way out of the hole. He'd also had a little bit of a problem with the Magic Moments from the Tonight Show release, which was it was a success, but it was overdone somewhat. So he had a large hole to dig out of, and he needed bands that at least were moving some product, like Kiss, to get back into the studio and record more product. At the time, there was a little bit of a coup going on in the background, with Kiss potentially looking to leave for a different label. So Neil takes control. Neil takes them into the studio. Neil produces. So he was very much able to fulfill that role. Neil Bogart, of course, had come up through the industry and had produced acts, had also, had an ear for catchy hits on the radio in the bubblegum realm. That's where he made his mark before striking out on his own. Whatever the case, there's always going to be a bit of fan disappointment with the Dressed to Kill box set. There simply isn't just a box called Alive, comprising the 5 component shows that were recorded for the Alive project. On the one hand, yes, I agree. On the other hand, we're getting Dressed to Kill dealt with as well, which otherwise probably wouldn't happen. So I'll take this as a win, and we'll find out when the Alive box set comes out whether what we thought was potentially viable or possible for an Alive box on its own was even viable in the first place. All right, so first of all, just take care of those 2 live shows quickly. One recording for the live project commenced in May 1975. The Dressed to Kill tour had only been on the road for just over a month. They'd kicked off at the end of March. They did the warm-up shows in Northampton and then at the Beacon for the press show, and then hit the road on, I think it's the 27th. It might have been Kenosha. They didn't even have their new costumes ready prior to the first show, and on May the 16th at Cobo, that was the debut of the Dressed to Kill costumes. So they'd had a day of rehearsal at the Michigan Palace. That's where they shot the promo films for Come On and Love Me and Rock and Roll All Night in all the glory. That's also included on the Blu-ray for the first time, I believe, a video component. So at that time, the initial Kiss Live project envisaged 3 sides live, taking place in Vegas, and 1 side of new studio cuts, exactly what Kiss Alive 2 became in 1977. So that's really cool to consider the purpose of some of the songs that were potentially included on Disc 2 and why they exist. And one thing I think that's very important to differentiate, and I've spoken about this in comments on the FAQ message board, but it doesn't seem to translate very well into words. I'll see if I can do any better. talking about it. I think there's a big differentiation that needs to be made between live, in quotes, and alive. And it's more than semantics, which is a big word like gymnasium. The decision was made to transform from a live album from what is a fixed live recording. It's a performance recorded with minimal fixes and presented organically. So a live recording is exactly that. It can be an off the soundboard is a good example of a live recording. There's very minimal fixes applied to it. It really is just capturing the performance. You get a little bit bleed through from mics to be able to hear the audience. But in terms of it being a fully mixed, fully presented, coherent product, it's a very different beast than a live. A live is a immersive representation of not just a concert or a performance, but an experience. And that's what sets it apart from those component shows. And we'll find, again, we'll have proof of that when we get the Alive box. But more than that, you can play the Kobo recording on this box set or Davenport, the first show, and just compare it directly with Alive, the remaster or the 2014 version that you have in your collection. You will hear the difference automatically between that performance. And it's like speaking now, that I will stutter or misspeak or make something while I'm in the flow of talking. So is the same in a musical performance. Moving around on stage, Paul Stanley was a whirling dervish of activity while leading the circus. Gene Simmons, with his crab jumps and all his activity, was an active demon or bat lizard, whatever he was at that point. And Ace Frehley, teetering on the brink of a battle with gravity, was Ace. So all of these guys would have various things where they were slow to get back on a mic, they misspoke a word, they hit a bum note, bum chord, got slightly out of sync as a group. Peter, generally as the drummer, was rock solid at this time, but that didn't mean that he wasn't also late on mic or had a performance issue. Again, a drummer, highly cardio infused performance. So you get that in a live recording, and that's part of the DNA that makes those recordings so endearing, is that you hear the human element. But on what became the live format with Kiss Alive, all of that's removed. Much of the organic nature of the live performance is distilled out of the product in order to make that representation of the moment perfection. Therefore, there are embellishments around the explosions, around the sound, around the panning. It doesn't just transform you there, because you still know that there's a big difference between being in the audience at a concert and listening to a Kiss Alive or another very good live recording. But if you were to try and describe a concert to a non-fan, you would probably want to play a live for them rather than some bootleg audience recording or even a soundboard for that matter. They're two completely different things. One is margarine and the other is butter. So full-fat dairy butter. So it was common sense that they wanted to fix some of it because they could be sloppy and subpar under the unforgiving microscope of the remote truck. So they probably listened back to these shows and said, Christ, do we sound like that? It may have been, marginal, but I think what these recordings on this box set really kind of prove is that they gave Eddie Kramer a list of things that he would need to address, things that he would have to do in order to transform a recording into more than just a recording, but something honest that guarantees good. So there we are. I think it's not a mistake. It's a sensible decision, and suggests that they knew what they were doing. And Eddie quickly, figured out with recording Kobo, recording Cleveland, and then recording the other ones, that they had to do something different in order to create something that really represented Kiss well. All right, so back now to CD2, the demos and rarities. The first 4 tracks on this CD are the studio demos dating from 2 pairs of Larrabee studio sessions in January and June 1975. They've often been lumped together, and now we know erroneously, simply because they came from the same studio. They were both recorded during gaps in Kiss's touring schedule. The first time in January with shows canceled, they had a gap, so they go in and they record a couple of songs. That gives them a head start for material for the sessions that would quickly follow in February, an Electric Lady in New York when they get home. So that gives birth to Rock and Roll All Night. The story is well known, so I'm not going to redo that. I do think there is probably a demo story for that song already available on this channel, so please feel free to check that out. 4 of the tracks have circulated for years. I think it goes back to about 2008, maybe a little bit later than that, whatever the case is. But those actually came from a mixed down edit reel, not from the master reels. And that's what makes the inclusion of these songs very cool. Universal has taken the decision, with those full multi-track tapes available to them, to provide fresh, modern 2025 mixes for those songs. And as a result, we're getting representation of the full music track recorded back in 1975. So, yeah, long-winded way of saying that the versions on the box set are longer than the versions that have circulated in fan circles for decades, and they're of far superior audio quality. The reference mix for Mistake previously ran to 3 minutes 45 seconds. Now it's a full 4:34, and it's pristine. It's utterly pristine, which is glorious for that song in particular, since it's such an outlier in the Kiss catalog. It's a very unusual song for Kiss to be recording. The song had been considered for previous Kiss albums. I think it dated back to the first one, but it never found a form. So, modern mixing utilizes a different ethos from the original edited reference mix. So there are elements that you can hear on this 2025 version, such as Paul noting break, or other sections where there's soft speaking throughout with him, almost doing a little bit of vocal experimentation. You can hear that more on this because it's not hidden in the reference mix that was done in 1975. That gives the song a completely different vocal character, or different character and listening experience to the pristine 1975 reference mix. It's a completely different song in this form because, again, the engineer who has done a wonderful job mixing it now has made it sound completely different to what it was in 1975. And that's exciting. And the decision to lead off with Mistake is similarly bold. It's a slide guitar laid-back track that feels like an echo of the musical hodgepodge that was Wicked Lester. It really sounds more transitionary between Wicked Lester and Kiss than Kiss in 1975. The slide guitar, well, I don't think it's right to really call it slide. Some people have said, oh no, it's lap steel. No, it's not. It's actually a slightly detuned guitar with Paul using a pencil and a glass jar to do that effect and give it that kind of country vibe. So it's more Southern California than New York City. Gene's backing vocal remains very heavy-handed for the song. I think his bass is pretty prominent in this mix. Peter's anchored in Charlie Watt territory here, just keeping time and playing to the song. There's no heavy-handedness or over-embellishment coming into play here. He's doing what a drummer is supposed to do and what he knew how to do: play to the song, establish a pocket. And Ace is just wailing along with subtlety until the song breaks down into its fun Beatlesque ending. It's a very unconventional sound for Kiss, much as Love Song was an outlier for AC/DC. But it also foreshadows gentle stylistic shifts that the band would take, such as Hard Luck Woman. It aligns well with Sticky Fingers' era Stones, specifically Wild Horses. And lyrically and in terms of its arrangement, it feels very much still a work in progress. So this was just, let's remember a song and get it down on tape. Track 2 is Rock and Roll All Night. This has gone through quite a few titles over the years. On a January 1975 reference acetate, it was called I Wanna Rock and Roll All Day and Party All Night. On a reference reel, it's called Rock and Roll All Night, Party All Day. And yeah, whatever. On the reference reel, which isn't included on this box, unfortunately, there was a false start with 2 seconds of drum and a Fonz-like Gene saying, hey, before it cuts. The 2025 mix is reasonably faithful to the 1975 mix, but it does lower the hand clapping parts in the mix and raises it elsewhere. So there's just a different balance of where that hand clapping was deemed most suitable by the engineer doing the mix. And that's a kind of whatever, matter of taste. Special attention has been given to the bass and drums, and there's plenty of low end on the mix. It's a very pleasurable listen. The difference between the 75 and 2025 mixes is very noticeable on the second January demo. Anything for My Baby. Its warmth is enveloping, and the bass line pulses, and there's very Ringo-like drumming, or Charlie. Again, great timekeepers in the pocket. It's a hybrid 60s pop throwback, the song. I think a lot of fans have loved this one just because it really is kind of a fun pop song and the sort of thing Neil Bogart would have loved. The 1975 mix was tinny and shrill on the reference edit, and it was cut down to just 2 minutes in that form. Here, the full recording continues with an additional vocal ad-lib section and lyrics. Drums are lowered in the mix now, almost muffled, and the bass is better balanced with the vocal widened. So they've widened the audio to make it fuller on the vocal, and it really does help it. The treatment here feels less like a demo, whereas the 1975 mix really does feel like just a functional edit mix. So that's part of the difference in how engineers approach mixing material now with how it would have been done contemporaneously. Burning Up with Fever was released as the first single from the new box, giving it a hint that a modern treatment had been applied to the sonics of some of the material. For my ears, there was also a hint that the multitrack had been treated, potentially including plugins and other EQ and character adjusting techniques. Gene's growl continues to be a key effect to set the mood, and it sets the tone, giving it character and context. The overall warmth and consistency is assisted with a gentle mastering that protects the audio from brick walling. And that's one other thing I want to just call out. This box set is beautifully mastered. The material has not been bricked. They've really dialed it back away from the loudness wars, and that makes the listening experience much more pleasurable and less exhausting. The new mix smooths out what were really gritty, ballsy rhythm guitars. That's a big change. Those guitars on the 75 reference mix are crunchy. The drums sound richer, fuller, and some elements may be a difference between modern 2-inch transfer versus quarter-inch. There could be quality issues on the old reference edit transfer. I think more than likely there's been just the methodology of 2025 and working with multitracks is that analog multitracks are pulled into digital individually, and then they're thrown onto a DAW, a digital audio workstation, and then each one of those tracks is going to be aligned and they're going to be treated. And whether that's with plugins, filters, or other tools, it really gives them more to work with, in addition to the engineer having a different sonic kind of fingerprint than 1975. So that's part of what I love about these 4 songs, is that they have taken a very bold decision to really work these up into something much more than just a demo. The 1975 edit mix that isn't included here is a completely different thing. And I'm going to probably keep saying that because I really think that edit mix should have been provided on this box set to provide contemporaneous comparison with what they were doing. It doesn't take away from the validity of those new mixes, but there should be something with which to contrast them. You don't go into a buffet. No, we're not doing Kiss, stuff like that. There's a hint of reverb on Gene's vocal that adds to the atmosphere on Burning Up with Fever, and the guitar solo totally steals the show here. The forms of these demos are a massive improvement, regardless of any of that sonic voodoo that's been performed on them. An additional minute of the original recording is now presented, compared with the previous circulating version, so... Notable on this new mix is the presence of studio banter on the front and end, which takes the listener into the recording studio with Kiss 50 years ago. And that's a very fun element to be a part of. It makes you feel like more of a fly on a wall during the sessions when you're listening to this box. But between the taming of the rhythm guitar and balancing of Gene's vocal, you can hear his breaths where they had to be in the atmosphere, and it really is illustrative of the grand work done by the modern engineer. It's pure sonic art. Pausing to take stock of the 4 known demos, there are some concerns and questions. First, it must be noted that the sound is spectacular. The treatment applied has transformed the recordings from pure demo to a higher level recording, and therefore has changed the construct employed. Clearly, it's been done, if not with love, but certainly not with contempt, and most certainly with competency. But it has to be called out. The new 2025 studio demo remixes illustrate the difference between the contemporaneous flat reference mix, which sounds very much like minimal effort was put into it just to hear the songs, here's what they sound like, now we'll decide what to do with them when we go into the studio for real, if we use them. And it has more of a traditional demo feel. It's raw, it's roughly mixed and EQ'd. It's just the bass guitars and drum and vocal. These are completely different. So I don't think those songs should have been listed as studio demos, because they're not. They should have been, as I've noted, referenced as 2025 studio demo remixes. But they also do say that they were mixed this year. They're not hiding the fact in the liner notes, so I'm not accusing them of any shenanigans. But 99% of listeners aren't going to give a toss about the differentiation between those two descriptors and some of the stuff that I've talked about. But it does concern me going down the road that tweaking material and presenting it through a new lens becomes addictive and dangerous and can quickly lead down the path to disrespecting an artist's body of work via AI stems, plugins, and other manipulative techniques that create something that wasn't intended to be. So AI tools are very valuable, plugins are very valuable, but with the power of those tools comes an obligation to be respectful of an artist's intent and purpose. One additional thing to note about these two sessions is the January session was, of course, Rock and Roll All Night and Anything for My Baby. The second sojourn into the studio in June was Mistaken Burning Up with Fever. They were recorded at a time when that live project still aligned with the original concept that I mentioned earlier of 3 sides live, 1 side new studio. So I think that those two potentially were under consideration, at least in some part, for potential use on the studio side of Kiss Live. Once Alive becomes the album, then those are dropped. And as we see, I think it's a month or so later when the band go into Magnet Graphics to record demos for what became the Destroyer album with Bob Ezrin, Burning Up with Fever was re-recorded again. A mistake had already been discarded, so clearly that one had not worked. So chronologically, those two demos are more alive than Dressed to Kill and not really Destroyer. Hopefully that makes sense. But back to the obvious, while intended as new studio tracks for a live album, the material certainly fit better on Dressed to Kill as a product or a box, which leaves Don't You Hesitate way out there, because that also aligns very well with Dressed to Kill, but there we are. That was definitely a Magnet Graphic demo for Destroyer. All right, so as noted earlier, on the reference reel, there's a foreshadowing of the Fonz type vocal, the hey at the beginning of Rock and Roll All Night, and the party mix of Rock and Roll All Night on the box. It's completely irrational. It's over the top, it's ludicrous, it's cluttered, and hilariously fun, the party mix, for a single listen for my taste. There were apparently 2 sessions, one on the West Coast and one on the East Coast, where Casablanca's staff and members of the road crew were recruited for the embellishments. Hand clapping and zipper ripping may have worked, but here in this form it's too much, but it's very creative. The final version from the demo sessions is just an alternative vocal, and it seems to be a different take with more cowbell and hand clapping. Some of that, again, can come down to what the mixing engineer was able to hear on the multi-tracks. It's seemingly based musically more similar to track 2, though in parts it's near identical, but at least it continues on to the party ending, or where the party breaks down. Another version of Rock and Roll All Night follows, because clearly one cannot rock and roll all night too much, especially at our ages. This one's an alternative vocal from the January 25th demo session, so one might call this one the more cowbell version. At the tail end, it breaks down, though someone clearly thought that the take sounded beautiful. The retention of the studio banter here, again, is transformative, and again, you get that peek behind the mist of time. You get to be a fly on the wall, so hopefully they've left studio banter in on the reels where it's supposed to be, not move that around. That would change the honesty and legitimacy if it's been shifted from one song to another to make that one more interesting, where the comments originally aligned with something else. The extended version of Room Service from February the 12th is the first recording from Electric Lady, the album sessions proper, 35 seconds longer than the album version where it fades out. This version continues with an additional chorus repetition and unstructured Paul vocal call-outs. It's loose, it's rock and roll, and Neil is heard at the end saying that he knew they could do it better. 6 takes were attempted that day, but only 2 were complete, with the last providing the album master. This extended outtake aligns perfectly with the album version, suggesting it is simply the full take rather than take 1. An instrumental outtake features as track 16 on the collection. The lead-in studio banter could have been edited with the engineer saying rolling doesn't add much to this one as a fly on the wall. That said, it's a fun take, though it seems to lose cohesion due to the absence of the guitar solo in the middle. As an instrumental, it nicely illustrates Peter's pocket drumming and the freight train-like rock and roll chug of the song. I challenge you not to bop your head along with this one or even start singing the lyrics because it really is infectious. The alternative mix of Two Timer also dates from February the 12th, with more emphasis on the underlying acoustic guitar tracks. Gene's vocal is sufficiently different to suggest that this version is culled from a different take. Probably the track 13, the extended alternate mix without the electric guitars and less vocal treatment. But wait, there's more. Track 17 is an instrumental outtake. It's a good solid run-through of the track, which doesn't align with either of the other versions, suggesting it's based on yet another take. Interestingly, just 4 takes were recorded that day, with the first breaking down after just 25 seconds. The remaining 3 were complete, with the 4th comprising the album master. Therefore, it appears that all of the usable takes from February the 12th are represented on this collection in one form or another. For fans of the Beatles, the minor and sometimes evolutionary state of varying takes is of interest, so this collection finally scratches a similar itch while being slightly more willing to stretch into the reinterpreted territory. That'll be a double-edged sword for purists, though with the raw multi-tracks of various takes available, an engineer can only follow their gut for the preparation of that unreleased material. And I think that's part of the key thing again about this. These are just not takes. These are an engineer after the fact deciding that there are elements that can be focused on presenting each of them rather than just repeating take 1, take 2, take 3. They all sound the same. They break down in different parts. If you focus on an acoustic guitar part of one take, if you focus on a drum part in one take, I think it's a fair way to treat the material, but also give you more insight into what was part of the construction of these songs. So we also don't know exactly all the track sheets for all the takes. Some of the real boxes are included in the printed material for the box, but whether or not that's accurate for every single one of these tracks, those are worth reading as well. So that's the importance of the product, is to be able to reference, okay, here's a track sheet, here's a real box. How many takes are on there? What's the state of the takes? Are they partials? Are they incomplete? Fortunately, on a lot of them as well, they identified the takes that were going to be bounced to master. So very, very, very interesting stuff to the Kiss nerd. Keeping things interesting is an alternate ending version of Ladies in Waiting from February the 11th. The album master was taken from a different take recorded February the 15th, and unfortunately, the collection doesn't include any images of real boxes for information about this version, so we don't really know how many takes were done that day. It's noticed that the song was mixed on February the 19th, which aligns quite closely with the album version, but it's missing the lead guitar overdubs during the ending part of the song and completely continues on to a longer fade-out. With such negligible differences, it could simply be a source from which the album master was edited. This take actually feels a little bit like filler, as fun as the song is. An alternate version of Come On and Love Me is based on a recording from February the 16th. Certainly the album master was sourced from a take recorded that day, but it's also unknown here how many takes were recorded of that song. This recording emphasizes the acoustic guitar underpinning. That was a very Bachman-Turner overdrive type technique that was used to obtain their distinctive sound. And the recording screams thick, heavy-gauge guitar strings, which might also have been a similar playbook employed by BTO. It's a little disappointing in this case, particularly that there wasn't a lower form demo available. You know, I had high hopes that we would get Paul Stanley sitting in a hotel room with an early tape recorder solo with an acoustic guitar. And in my mind's eye, that would have been a beautiful thing, but I guess the speed at which the band were living might render that fantasy utterly ridiculous. I would still love, a little bit more detail about the birth and genesis of this song, so I'll have to recheck the book to see what Paul's current memories are of the creative process behind that. But even in this form, there's a brute force that belies the pop power of the album track. It really is a powerful and attractive song. The doubling of guitars, acoustics with electrics, that wasn't something too dissimilar to what Bob Ezrin did later in the studio. He doubled guitars with piano chords, or he deployed what was known as the rub, having two guitars, one slightly out of tune with the other, doubling it to thicken the sound. So lots of different techniques are employed in the studio for Kiss to obtain the sonic signature on each of these albums, and it's just very interesting to hear some of those elements separated out so we can focus on it. So the track appears to have been culled from a different take and continues on for an additional 30 seconds before breaking down. And this one has a great ending that is worthy of a smile and also justifies its inclusion on the box set. 7 takes of Anything for My Baby were recorded on February the 11th, but only 4 of those were complete or marked complete. The master was taken from take 7, and the alternate mix, which is track 11, and extended alternate mix track 11 from that take. The former emphasizes acoustic guitar and features bigger drums. The extended mix has the electrics and more balanced instrumentation. Track 20 is 20 seconds longer from a different take. As an extended instrumental, it's big and brash and a fun listen with the dynamics of the mix presented, particularly on the chorus with the rolling drums and thick guitars. I'm not absolutely certain, but I don't think the album version is from any of these outtakes. The alternate mix, track 11, and the extended alternate mix, track 14, are probably from different takes. Lover All I Can had been performed at the very first Kiss show in January 1973. As a Wicked Lester survivor, it's understandable that its pop potential would have appealed to Neil Bogart at a time the group was short of material. A whopping 10 takes were recorded February the 25th, with take 8 marked for the master. As had previously been the case, the alternative mix, track 12, might simply have been the album master with more reverb and electric guitars removed. It certainly places the focus on the acoustic guitars underpinning the track. The instrumental track 20 appears to be from a completely different take, though there were 6 extra takes to choose from. To remind the listener that Rock'n Roll All Night is included on this collection, and the album, the first Electric Lady recording from February the 12th, is included as a super fast outtake. Perhaps after recording 3 takes on February the 11th, of which only 1 was complete and a second near complete, and 12 more takes the following day, the band simply wanted that damn song done. But only 4 complete takes were accomplished out of those 12. So they recorded 5 more takes of the song on February the 13th, with the final of those becoming the master. The fun ending on this seems a scream for mercy. As advertised, it is fast, though Slayer wouldn't be impressed by the tempo. Gene's vocal seems rushed and uncomfortable, and the song is awkward after an eternity listening to the album version of the song and that version's tempo being etched on the brain. This one's a novelty at best, since the arrangement should have been set in concrete long before 3 days were spent on the song. Then again, Neil wanted a pop anthem, and an anthem was about vibe and emotion, so perhaps he simply wasn't hearing what he knew the band could do and was willing to burn tape until he got what he wanted out of them. I wonder, would anyone buy a standalone CD of all 3 days' takes, plus all the Larrabee takes for this one song alone? Is anyone that bonkers? The instrumental version of Getaway is clearly a different take than take 3 recorded on February the 13th. Unless other takes were captured on other days, then this instrumental without vocal and lead overdubs may have been take 2, the only other complete take of that song that day. Most of the differences between the takes center around the drums. After opening with a single guitar playing the main verse riff, there's no double snare strike before the bass kicks in with both guitars for a second repetition of the verse riff. Stripped of vocals and other overdubs, the bass and drums feature prominently to fully illustrate the throwback rocker's attitude. Gene's bass line shines with economical drumming from Peter. Again, this is another one of the great pop songs from this album, and it's understandable why it made the album, or why it was written for the album, as it completely fits the construct of an up-tempo pop song. Rock Bottom, an instrumental-only outtake from the tail end of the sessions, recorded February the 24th or 25th, is included, and there were a whopping 14 takes recorded on the 24th, but only 3 were complete, with take 14 becoming the master. The intro was recorded separately with what appears to be 3 passes. Track sheet suggests that the intro was sparse, with just 4 of the multi-tracks used, 2 each for Paul and Ace for acoustic and overdub. 12 string acoustics used to render Ace's gorgeous composition, the purpose of which was to stretch the album duration while offering a contrast to the general rock material included on the album. The rock part of the song appears to be a different take than the album version, but unfortunately there's a tuning section prior to the take that really seems unnecessary here. I'm not sure why you'd just include that other than stretching the duration of the bonus CD. There we go. But the purpose of the track is to allow inspecting of the underlying musical track again, and it's successful for that exploration and enjoyment. So again, what they've done with it is very worthwhile treatment and very entertaining for those who are interested in those sorts of details. I'm sure this disc will become absolute torture to people who just like the album and are really not interested in the creative process, but there we go. At least some of us have that option. Another Wicked Lester revamp follows She. It had been part of the set in 1974. I think it was at the first show as well, but certainly it's included here as an extended instrumental outtake. It dates from the very end of the album sessions. 5 takes were recorded on February the 26th. And I think that falls within the touring window. They did a little 3-date mini tour in between finishing up recording and the album being mastered. So the album master of the song was taken from take 5, but of the 5 takes, only 2 were complete. So there seems to be enough different here to indicate that this track is the second complete take from that day, unless the song was included in other sessions on other days for which we don't have track sheets or billing receipts. This one continues on just to an ending jam, and the clarity and separation on this mix is fantastic, and you really get enveloped by the song's heavy groove. So again, it's another very successful treatment of the material from the studio sessions. Fittingly, the CD concludes with yet another version of Rock and Roll All Night. And it's a bonus. It's an unlisted 24th track. On the LP edition, it's presented as a separate flexi disc. And that's a very cool novelty that's sorely been overlooked previously in box sets. So I'm very pleased that Universal has thought outside the box and done something different in terms of the tchotchkes in the packaging, at least for the vinyl version, which also includes a slip mat. So those are 2 things in there that I don't think there are any additional items in the CD box. But the instrumental outtake for this one is simply yet another take of the song from February the 12th. This more appealing bonus version is an alternate studio demo, whatever that means. The track's attributed to the February the 19th session, where 2 alternate mixes were prepared, presumably from previous takes. Acoustic guitars are very present in the mix, along with the electrics, and the bass is very forward in the mix. This mix presents a slightly slinkier, laid-back vibe. Chorus vocals are heavily reverbed, and fortunately, the party atmosphere comes across and the clapping is in sync. It's an edit, so it's just 2 minutes and 15 seconds, and it fades out with only the vocals. It's a fun ending to the CD, so we'll take that one as a win. So that's a walk through all the audio on CD2 of the Dress to Kill box set. Again, I'm going to talk about the shows included in the box separately on the full panel because, again, there's not as much detail to go into there. But this one I really wanted to use as both a written review and a podcast episode. I think this is batting above its weight. They've done a very good job with how they've touched all of those different takes. And again, looking at real boxes, you see how many takes were recorded. There's enough difference between the various takes for them to be worthy, and where they focused in more, they've lowered the levels on electric and raised the level on acoustic in order to focus that when they've done their mixes. I think it's fair. They've also worked with some of the studio banter, some of the extraneous material to really, this I think is the first CD that really takes you into the sessions as such. They only hinted at that with material on the Creatures box set, but I think there they had much more variety to work with among the unreleased songs and some of the different takes. So again, this continues to be yet another successful box set as far as I'm concerned from Universal. Destroyer, again, imperfect with especially that live CD on that one, but in terms of the demos and the material that illustrates the construction of that album, very successful. Creatures of the Night, it was a home run from start to finish, every aspect of that box, with the only exclusion being the song that wasn't able to be found in time to be included on it. Doesn't detract from the success of all that live material, how it was treated, and all the demo and studio material as well. So Dressed to Kill has done the same. We have the announcement, or the full details of the Alive box set are now out at the time of recording this. So fans are going to have some questions about what's happening with that material. I'll wait for more, details to be available before going into that one. But I think the Dressed to Kill box on its own justifies the splitting of all of the material available from 1975 with two albums to be two separate products. I don't think you could have jammed this and all the Alive stuff in together and treated it fairly. Opinions, again, will vary on how much value there is around the live CD, which I clearly enjoy. Do what's right for you. Again, I think they've done a great job with reimagining the 1975 demos, of which there are only 4 to play with. They've turned that, turned that around very successfully. I still say, and I've said it, I think 3 or 4 times, that they should have included that reference edit. And since they haven't, perhaps they can do that as a 12-inch for Record Store Day. Because again, it's a completely different character. Pristine does exist. I've used it to reference it. It should have been here in order to contrast what they were doing with that material. It would have just made that even more legitimate by saying, this is what we think of it in 2025, but this is what it sounded like in 1975. Hopefully one day that'll come out so listeners will be able to make their own judgment. All right, that's it. Dressed to Kill, Super Deluxe Edition 2025. I call it a win. Tune in for our podcast episode where we review the whole package as a panel with a lot less detail, but probably quite a bit more opinions and emotion. Thanks for your support.